The first photograph appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped under the front door of the Sterling house, like a whisper of trouble to come. Elena Sterling found it while rushing to get Sophie ready for school, her coffee still steaming in the kitchen as autumn light filtered through the tall windows of their Beacon Hill Victorian. The image was innocuous enough, a wide shot of their house taken from across the street, the kind of photo a real estate agent might use for a listing. But Elena Sterling had not hired any real estate agent, and their house was decidedly not for sale. "Mom, you're staring at that paper like it might bite you." Sophie's voice cut through Elena's growing unease. At 9 years old, her daughter possessed the uncomfortable ability to read adults with surgical precision, a skill that had sharpened considerably since Michael's death 2 years ago. Sophie stood in the doorway wearing her school uniform, her dark hair braided with the mathematical precision she brought to everything these days, her backpack clutched tight against her chest like armor. Elena quickly folded the photograph and slipped it into her jacket pocket. "Just checking the mail, sweetheart. Ready for school." But Sophie's dark eyes, so much like Michael's that it sometimes took Elena's breath away, remained fixed on her mother's face with the intensity of a detective studying a crime scene. Since her father's death in that airplane crash, Sophie had developed an almost supernatural awareness of anything that might threaten their carefully reconstructed sense of safety. "Was it a bill?" Sophie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew it wasn't. "Nothing important." Elena forced brightness into her voice, the same artificial cheer she'd been perfecting for 2 years now. "Come on, or you'll be late for Ms. Rodriguez's math test." They walked the 6 blocks to Sophie's school through the crisp Boston morning. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The sensation crawled up her spine like cold fingers, making her glance over her shoulder at parked cars and shadowed doorways. But the tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill revealed nothing more threatening than joggers and dog walkers beginning their daily routines. The Winthrop Academy sat like a red brick fortress at the corner of Mount Vernon and Joy Streets, its ivy-covered walls radiating the kind of old Boston respectability that Elena's late husband Michael had insisted was worth the crushing tuition payments. Even now, 2 years after his death, Elena continued to make those payments from the dwindling remains of his life insurance, determined that Sophie's education wouldn't become another casualty of their loss. "Mom," Sophie said as they reached the school's wrought iron gates, "if someone was taking pictures of our house, would you tell me?" The question hit Elena like ice water. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" Sophie adjusted her backpack straps with the nervous precision she'd developed since Michael's death. "Sometimes I see flashes of light from my bedroom window at night, like camera flashes. And yesterday, when I was walking home from Emma's house, I saw a man sitting in a car across from ours. He had a big camera with a long lens." Elena knelt down to Sophie's eye level, studying her daughter's serious face. The child therapist they'd been seeing since Michael's death had warned Elena that children who'd experienced sudden loss often developed hypervigilance, an exhausting state of constant alertness to potential threats. But Sophie's observations had proven unnervingly accurate in the past. "Can you describe the man?" "Tall, dark hair, expensive car. Silver like Dad's old BMW. He pretended to be on his phone, but the camera was in his lap and I could see him watching our house." The specific details delivered with Sophie's characteristic matter-of-fact precision sent fresh alarm through Elena's chest. This wasn't childhood anxiety or imagination. This was surveillance. "Sophie, I want you to promise me something. If you see that man again or anyone else taking pictures of our house, you tell me immediately. And you don't approach them or try to investigate on your own." Sophie nodded gravely. "Are we in danger?" The question hung in the cool October air between them like smoke. Elena pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and the innocence that somehow persisted despite everything they had been through. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we're going to be very careful until we figure out what's going on." After dropping Sophie at school, Elena drove through the winding streets of Boston with her mind racing through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The photograph in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, and Sophie's description of the mysterious photographer made her skin crawl with remembered fear. 2 years ago, in the weeks following Michael's death, Elena had experienced a brief period of paranoia that her therapist had attributed to grief and shock. She'd become convinced that Michael's plane crash wasn't an accident, that someone had been following her, that their house was being watched. Dr. Patricia Winters had gently but firmly guided Elena away from these thoughts, explaining that conspiracy theories were a common response to sudden traumatic loss, the mind's attempt to impose order and meaning on senseless tragedy. Elena had accepted this explanation, had taken the prescribed medications, had attended the grief counseling sessions, and had gradually rebuilt some semblance of normal life. But now, holding physical evidence that someone was indeed watching their house, she wondered if her previous instincts had been more accurate than anyone had realized. The Sterling family architectural firm occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in the Fort Point district overlooking Boston Harbor. Elena had inherited the business from Michael, though inherited might have been too generous a term for what remained. Most of their major clients had departed after Michael's death, either out of discomfort with working with his widow or simple business pragmatism. The firm now consisted primarily of Elena, two junior architects, and a part-time office manager who had stayed on more out of loyalty than financial incentive. Elena climbed the stairs to her office, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty building. The space still bore Michael's aesthetic stamp. Exposed brick walls, industrial fixtures, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the drafting tables with natural light. His favorite coffee mug still sat on the windowsill, now filled with pencils rather than the strong black coffee he'd consumed in dangerous quantities. She settled at her desk and pulled out the photograph, studying it with the analytical eye she'd developed during 15 years of architectural training. The image had been taken from across Beacon Street, probably from the public garden side, using a telephoto lens. The angle and lighting suggested it had been shot in the early morning around the time she and Sophie typically left for school. This wasn't a casual snapshot or a random real estate photo. This was professional surveillance conducted by someone with expensive equipment and knowledge of their daily routines. Elena's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone to call her mother. Dr. Catherine Sterling had been the family's anchor since Michael's death, the steady presence who had helped Elena navigate the labyrinth of grief, single parenthood, and financial uncertainty. Kate, as she preferred to be called, had retired from her psychology practice 6 months after Michael's death to help care for Sophie and support Elena's gradual return to professional life. Elena, Kate's voice carried immediate concern. After 35 years of practicing therapy, she developed an uncanny ability to read emotional distress through the smallest vocal cues. "Mom, I need to ask you something and I need you to give me an honest answer. Do you think someone might be watching our house?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough to make Elena wonder if the call had dropped. When Kate finally spoke, her voice carried a gravity that Elena hadn't heard since the first days after Michael's death. "Why would you ask that question?" "Because someone slipped a surveillance photo under our door this morning, and Sophie says she's been seeing a man with a camera parked outside our house. Mom, I need to know. Am I being paranoid or should I be worried?" Another long pause. "Elena, I think you should come home. There are some things we need to discuss." The tone of Kate's voice, carefully controlled but tinged with something that might have been fear, sent ice through Elena's veins. "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that are better discussed in person." "Elena, how quickly can you get here?" An hour later, Elena sat in her mother's impeccably organized home office, a converted sunroom that overlooked the small garden behind their Beacon Hill house. Kate had moved in with Elena and Sophie after Michael's death officially to help with childcare, but really because none of them could bear the thought of living alone with their grief. Kate sat behind her antique mahogany desk, her silver hair pulled back in the elegant chignon she'd worn for as long as Elena could remember. At 64, she still possessed the sharp intelligence and unshakable composure that had made her one of Boston's most respected clinical psychologists. But today, Elena noticed something different in her mother's bearing, a tension that suggested carefully controlled fear. "Before I tell you what I'm about to tell you," Kate began, "I need you to understand that everything I did was to protect you and Sophie. Every decision, every omission, every lie I told was because I believed it was the only way to keep you both safe." The formal tone, so unlike Kate's usual warm directness, made Elena's heart race. "Mom, you're scaring me." Kate opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. 2 years ago, when Michael died in that plane crash, I hired a private investigator to look into the circumstances of the accident. "You did what?" Elena felt the room tilt around her. "Why would you do that without telling me?" "Because you were barely functional, Elena. You were so consumed by grief and shock that you could barely get out of bed, let alone make rational decisions about potential threats to our family's safety. Someone had to think clearly, and that someone was me. Kate opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Photographs, documents, investigative reports, financial records. Elena recognized some of the images, the wreckage of Michael's plane scattered across a Pennsylvania field, investigators combing through debris, official reports stamped with FAA logos. What did you find? Kate's hands were steady as she arranged the documents, but Elena noticed the slight tremor in her voice. Michael's plane didn't crash due to mechanical failure or pilot error, Elena. Someone sabotaged it. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, feeling the world reshape around her in ways she wasn't sure she could process. That's impossible. The FAA investigated. They found no evidence of sabotage. The FAA investigated what they were allowed to investigate, Kate corrected. But certain pieces of evidence were removed from the crash site before official investigators arrived. Certain witnesses were discouraged from speaking to federal agents. Certain financial records were sealed or destroyed before they could be subpoenaed. Elena stared at the papers scattered across Kate's desk, trying to make sense of information that contradicted everything she'd believed about her husband's death. Why would someone want to kill Michael? He was an architect, not a spy or a criminal or someone involved in dangerous business. Kate pulled out a specific document, a financial report with portions highlighted in yellow. 6 months before his death, Michael discovered some irregularities in the insurance policies for one of his major projects, the Waterfront Commons development downtown. Do you remember it? Elena nodded. The mixed-use complex had been one of Michael's largest projects, a 40-story tower that combined luxury condominiums with street-level retail space. The project had been plagued by cost overruns and delays, but it had eventually opened to great success. Michael found evidence that the insurance company had been systematically overbilling clients and keeping the excess premiums. We're talking about millions of dollars across dozens of projects. He was planning to go to the authorities with this information the week after his plane crashed. The implications hit Elena like a series of physical blows. Michael hadn't died in a random accident. He'd been murdered because he'd discovered fraud, and she'd spent 2 years grieving a tragedy while his killers had gone free. Who, she whispered, who was behind the fraud? Kate pulled out a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that has suggested old money and established power. Marcus Morrison, ODO of Atlantic Coast Insurance. His company held the policies for most of the major construction projects in Boston, including Michael's. Tom Chen, the private investigator I hired, believes Morrison ordered Michael's death to prevent exposure of the insurance fraud. Elena stared at the photograph, trying to commit every detail of Marcus Morrison's face to memory. This was the man who had stolen her husband, who had left Sophie fatherless, who had destroyed their family for the sake of protecting his criminal enterprise. Where is he now? Has he been arrested? Kate's expression grew even more grave. That's where things get complicated, Elena. Morrison disappeared 3 days after Michael's death. He liquidated his assets, closed his businesses, and vanished completely. The FBI has been looking for him for 2 years with no success. So he's just gone. He murders my husband and then disappears. Not gone, Elena. Hiding. And based on the surveillance photo you received this morning, I believe he's back. The photograph Elena had found under their door suddenly took on sinister new meaning. This wasn't random surveillance or a real estate scam. This was Marcus Morrison, or one of his associates, watching their house, studying their routines, planning something that Elena couldn't yet comprehend. Why would he come back? He got away with murder. Why risk exposure by showing up in Boston again? Kate leaned forward, her eyes reflecting a fear that Elena had never seen there before. Because there's something he wants, something he believes we have. Tom Chen thinks Morrison may have hidden assets in Michael's name before disappearing him, assets that legally belong to you now. Or he might be concerned that Michael left behind evidence of the insurance fraud that could still be used against him. Elena felt a cold certainty settling in her chest. He's not just watching us, is he? He's planning something. I believe so. Elena, I think we need to consider the possibility that you and Sophie are in immediate danger. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and Sophie's voice calling out from the foyer. Elena glanced at the clock and realized with shock that 3 hours had passed since she'd arrived at Kate's office. Sophie was home from school, and Elena hadn't even noticed the passage of time. "We can't let her know about this," Elena said urgently, beginning to gather up the papers spread across Kate's desk. "She's already anxious enough about security. If she finds out that someone actually killed her father, Elena, we have to tell her something. If Marcus Morrison is planning to make a move against our family, Sophie needs to understand the danger so she can protect herself." Before Elena could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway of the office, still wearing her school uniform, but carrying what appeared to be a small digital camera. "Mom, Grandma Kate, I need to show you something important." Sophie approached Kate's desk with the serious demeanor she'd adopted since Michael's death, setting the camera down and switching on its display screen. "I took this picture during lunch recess today." The image on the camera's screen made Elena's blood run cold. It showed a silver BMW parked across the street from the Winthrop Academy, and behind the wheel sat a man who matched Sophie's earlier description. Tall, dark-haired, well-dressed. But it was the telephoto lens mounted on the camera in his lap that confirmed Elena's worst fears. "Sophie," Kate said carefully, "where exactly did you see this man?" "He's been there every day for the past week, always during lunch when the kids are outside for recess. He pretends to be on his phone, but I can see him watching the playground through that big camera lens. Today I borrowed Jenny Morrison's camera from Photography Club and took this picture from inside the building." Elena and Kate exchanged glances loaded with shared terror. Sophie was being watched at school as well as at home. Marcus Morrison or his associates weren't just conducting surveillance. They were studying every aspect of their daily routines, probably planning the best time and place to make their move. "Sophie," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to follow my instructions exactly." Sophie nodded gravely, sensing the seriousness of the moment with the intuition she'd developed since becoming a child who'd lost a parent. "The man in this photograph is someone who meant to hurt our family. He's the reason your dad died, and now he's come back to try to hurt us too." Sophie's face went pale, but her expression remained steady. "What do we do?" Elena felt a surge of pride at her daughter's courage, even as her heart broke at the necessity of having this conversation. "We're going to be very careful, very smart, and we're going to work together to make sure he can't hurt us. But Sophie, this has to be our secret for now. We can't tell anyone at school or any of your friends what's happening." "Are we going to call the police?" Kate answered before Elena could speak. "We're going to do something better than that, sweetheart. We're going to set a trap." That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Elena and Kate sat in the living room with Tom Chen, the private investigator Kate had hired 2 years earlier. Chen was a compact, intense man in his 40s who'd spent 20 years with the Boston Police Department before starting his own investigative firm. His specialty was financial crimes and corporate fraud, exactly the kind of expertise they needed to understand Marcus Morrison's motivations and methods. "The surveillance confirms what I suspected," Chen said, studying Sophie's photograph of the man outside her school. "Morrison isn't planning a quick strike and disappearance. This is a long-term operation, which means he wants something specific from your family." "What could he possibly want?" Elena asked. "Michael's been dead for 2 years. Whatever evidence he had about the insurance fraud died with him." Chen pulled out his own folder of documents and photographs. "Maybe not. Elena, did Michael ever mention anything about hidden assets or offshore accounts?" "Never. He was scrupulously honest about financial matters. After his father's accounting firm went bankrupt when he was a teenager, Michael was obsessive about maintaining clean, transparent financial records." "That's exactly what I would have expected," Chen said. "But Morrison may not know that. He might believe that Michael discovered more than just the insurance fraud, maybe evidence of Morrison's other criminal activities, or the location of assets Morrison hid before he disappeared." Elena felt pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. So Morrison thinks Michael left behind information that could destroy him or lead to recovery of stolen money. Exactly. And since Michael's widow and daughter are the most likely people to have access to his personal effects, his computers, his files, Morrison sees you as either a threat or an opportunity. Kate leaned forward in her chair, her expression sharp with the kind of strategic thinking that had made her an excellent therapist. Tom, what would Morrison need from us to access Michael's personal information? Passwords, safe deposit box keys, knowledge of hiding places, access to personal computers or cloud storage accounts? Or he might simply want to search the house thoroughly without interference. The implication hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Morrison wasn't just watching them. He was planning to get them out of the way so he could search for whatever he believed Michael had hidden. How long do we have? Elena asked. Chen consulted his notes. Based on the pattern of surveillance, I'd estimate Morrison is planning to make his move within the next week or two. He's been watching your routines long enough to identify the best opportunity. Elena felt a cold determination settling in her chest, replacing the fear and confusion that had dominated her thoughts since morning. Marcus Morrison had already taken her husband from her. He would not take her daughter. What do you recommend? Chen and Kate exchanged glances, and Elena sensed they'd been developing a plan even before tonight's meeting. We set a trap, Kate said. We make Morrison believe he has the opportunity he's been waiting for, but we control the circumstances. We draw him into a situation where we can gather evidence of his crimes and ensure that he goes to prison for what he did to Michael. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Less dangerous than waiting for him to choose the time and place of confrontation, Chen pointed out. Right now, Morrison thinks he has the advantage of surprise and preparation. If we can flip that dynamic, we can protect your family and finally get justice for Michael. Elena looked around the living room where she and Michael had spent so many evenings planning their future together, where Sophie had taken her first steps, where they had opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays and built the kind of life that Marcus Morrison had stolen from them. What do you need me to do? Chen opened his laptop and began showing Elena photographs of Marcus Morrison taken from various angles and in different lighting conditions. First, you need to be able to recognize him instantly if you see him. Morrison is a master of disguise and false identities, but there are certain physical retry JN continue edit characteristics he can't change. Bone structure, height, the way he carries himself. Elena studied the images with the same analytical attention she brought to architectural blueprints. Morrison appeared to be in his early 60s with a kind of distinguished silver hair and expensive clothing that suggested success and respectability. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Cold and calculating, with the flat affects she'd learned to recognize in certain clients who viewed buildings not as spaces for human habitation, but as pure financial instruments. Second, Chen continued, we need to create an opportunity that Morrison can't resist. Based on his surveillance pattern, he's looking for a time when you and Sophie will be away from the house for an extended period, giving him unrestricted access to search for whatever he believes Michael hid. Well, what kind of opportunity? Kate answered. A weekend trip, somewhere that would require you and Sophie to be away from Boston for at least 48 hours, giving Morrison plenty of time to conduct a thorough search. Elena felt her stomach clench with anxiety. You want me to leave Sophie alone in a city where a murderer is stalking our family? Not alone, Chen said quickly. Sophie would be with you, but you'd both be under police protection the entire time. Meanwhile, we'd have the house under full surveillance, waiting for Morrison to make his move. The plan was logical, Elena had to admit, but the idea of using herself and Sophie as bait to lure a killer made her feel physically ill. She thought about Sophie's matter-of-fact courage when she'd shown them the photograph of their stalker, her daughter's determination to protect their family, despite being only 9 years old. There's something else you need to know, Kate said quietly. Elena, I don't think Marcus Morrison is working alone. Chen nodded grimly. The surveillance pattern suggests at least two people, one watching the house, another watching Sophie's school. And the level of planning and patience we're seeing indicates professional-level resources. Who would be helping him? Could be hired professionals, or it could be family members with their own reasons for wanting revenge against the Sterling family, Chen replied. Morrison has a son, James, who would be about 35 now. He also has connections to organized crime figures in Boston who might see this as an opportunity to profit from the insurance fraud Morrison committed. Elena felt the walls closing in around her. Not only was Marcus Morrison stalking her family, but he might have assembled a team of accomplices, each with their own skills and motivations for wanting to destroy what remained of the Sterling family legacy. Mom, she said, turning to Kate, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Anything. Was there ever a moment during the past 2 years when you suspected I might be in danger? Any time when you noticed surveillance or threats that you didn't tell me about? Kate was quiet for a long moment, and Elena saw something that looked like guilt flicker across her mother's features. There were incidents, small things that could have been coincidence but felt like more than that. A few times when I came home and things in the house seemed to have been moved slightly. Phone calls where no one spoke but the line stayed open. Cars that seemed to follow me when I was running errands. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were barely holding yourself together, Elena. You were seeing a therapist, taking medication for depression, struggling just to function as a single mother. I was terrified that if I told you someone might be stalking us, it would push you over the edge into complete breakdown. Elena understood her mother's reasoning, but the knowledge that she'd been kept in the dark about potential threats to her family's safety filled her with a complex mixture of gratitude and betrayal. So Morrison may have been planning this for 2 years. It's possible, Chen confirmed. He may have been waiting for you to recover enough from grief that you could provide him with the information he needs. A person in the depths of clinical depression can't remember passwords or locate hidden documents. But a person who's beginning to heal and rebuild their life might be able to access whatever Morrison thinks Michael left behind. The cruelty of it took Elena's breath away. Marcus Morrison hadn't just murdered her husband. He'd spent 2 years watching her slowly emerge from the darkness of grief, waiting for her to become functional enough to be useful to him. There's one more thing, Kate said, her voice heavy with reluctance. Elena, I need you to think carefully about this question. Did Michael ever give you anything unusual in the weeks before his death? A key, a code, an envelope, anything that seemed unimportant at the time but might have been his way of leaving you access to information. Elena closed her eyes and tried to recall those final weeks with Michael, a period that had become blurred by the intensity of her grief. He'd been working long hours on several major projects, coming home exhausted and distracted. She'd attributed his preoccupation to work stress, but now she wondered if he'd been dealing with the knowledge that he'd discovered something dangerous. There was one thing, she said slowly. The night before he'd left for that business trip to Philadelphia, the trip where his plane crashed, he gave me an envelope. He said it contained updated insurance information and that I should put it in our safe deposit box. Chen and Kate exchanged sharp glances. Did you ever open the envelope? No, after he died, I was so overwhelmed by the paperwork and legal issues that I just put it in the safe deposit box like he asked. I haven't thought about it since. Elena, Chen said urgently, that envelope might contain the evidence Morrison is looking for. If Michael knew he was in danger, if he suspected that someone might try to silence him, he might have left you documentation of Morrison's crimes as an insurance policy. The realization hit Elena like lightning. All this time, while Marcus Morrison had been planning his revenge, stalking her family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the evidence that could destroy him, had been sitting in a bank vault 3 blocks from their house. We need to get that envelope, she said. Not we, Chen corrected. You, Elena, you're the only person authorized to access that safe deposit box. But once you retrieve that envelope, once you know what Michael left for you, everything changes. Morrison will sense that his window of opportunity is closing and he'll be forced to act quickly. Elena looked around the room at the 2 people who had become her anchors in the storm of loss and uncertainty that had defined her life since Michael's death. Kate with her unwavering strength and protective instincts, Tom Chen with his professional expertise and commitment to justice, and upstairs sleeping peacefully, Sophie, the daughter who had already shown more courage than most adults Elena knew. When do we do this? Tomorrow morning, Kate said. Elena, I want you to go to the bank first thing when it opens. Tom and I will maintain surveillance on the house and on Sophie's school, making sure Morrison doesn't realize what we're doing. Elena nodded, feeling a strange mixture of terror and anticipation. Tomorrow she would finally learn what Michael had died trying to protect. Tomorrow she would understand why Marcus Morrison believed her family possessed something worth killing for. And tomorrow they would begin the process of bringing her husband's murderer to justice. That night, Elena lay awake in the bed she'd once shared with Michael, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd loved, the father of her child, hadn't died in a random accident, but had been murdered by someone who saw his commitment to honesty as a threat. She thought about the envelope sitting in their safe deposit box, waiting to reveal secrets that had cost Michael his life. What had he discovered about Marcus Morrison's insurance fraud? What evidence had he gathered that was worth killing for? And most importantly, what would Elena do with that information once she possessed it? Through the thin walls, she could hear Sophie talking quietly in her sleep, a habit she'd developed since Michael's death, carrying on conversations with her father that Elena had never interrupted. Tonight, her daughter's whispered words seemed to carry an urgency that made Elena's heart clench. "Daddy, I think the bad man is coming soon. I think he wants to hurt Mommy. I wish you were here to protect us." Elena slipped out of bed and padded quietly to Sophie's room, where she found her daughter curled around her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that had been a gift from Michael on her 4th birthday. In sleep, Sophie looked impossibly young and vulnerable, but Elena knew that behind those closed eyelids lay a mind that had already proven itself capable of recognizing danger and taking action to protect their family. "I'm going to keep you safe," Elena whispered, smoothing Sophie's dark hair away from her face. "Your daddy left us something that's going to help us catch the bad man. And when this is over, we're going to make sure he never hurts another family the way he hurt ours." As if she could hear her mother's promise even in sleep, Sophie's restless movements stilled, and her whispered conversations with Michael faded into peaceful silence. Elena returned to her own room and stood at the window, looking out at the quiet streets of Beacon Hill. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Morrison or one of his associates might be watching their house, planning their next move, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But Elena was done being a victim. Tomorrow she would retrieve Michael's envelope and learn the truth about his death. Tomorrow she would begin the process of transforming from hunted prey into a hunter seeking justice. The gift of truth was waiting for her in a bank vault wrapped in Michael's final act of love and protection. And Elena Sterling was finally ready to unwrap it. The First National Bank of Boston opened its doors at exactly 9 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and Elena Sterling was waiting on the granite steps when the security guard unlocked the heavy glass entrance. She'd been awake since 4, running through every possible scenario for what Michael's envelope might contain, each possibility more terrifying than the last. Tom Chen sat in an unmarked sedan across the street maintaining surveillance, while Kate stayed home with Sophie, who had been told she was too sick for school, a necessary deception that Elena hated but couldn't avoid. If Marcus Morrison was watching their remote teens, any deviation might alert him that the Sterling family was preparing to act. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she presented her identification to the bank manager, a thin woman with kind eyes who had known the Sterling family for over a decade. Mrs. Patterson had been the one to help Elena navigate the maze of financial paperwork after Michael's death, and her expression now reflected both professional discretion and personal concern. "Mrs. Sterling, I haven't seen you since you deposited that envelope 2 years ago. I hope everything is all right." "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. I just need to retrieve something my husband left for me." The safe deposit box vault lay deep in the bank's basement, behind steel doors that required 2 keys to open, Elena's and the bank's master key. As they descended the marble stairs, Elena felt the weight of 2 years of grief and uncertainty pressing down on her like physical force. Whatever Michael had left in that envelope had been important enough to kill for. In a few minutes, she would finally understand why her husband had died. Box 247 was small, designed to hold documents and valuables rather than large objects. Elena's key turned smoothly in the lock, and she lifted the metal lid with hands that shook despite her best efforts to remain calm. Inside lay only 3 items: her grandmother's pearl necklace, their marriage certificate in a manila envelope sealed with red wax and marked in Michael's careful handwriting. For Elena, "Open only if something happens to me." Elena's breath caught at the sight of Michael's handwriting, still crisp and precise after 2 years in the vault. The wax seal bore the impression of his architectural ring, the one he'd worn every day since graduating from MIT. This wasn't just a document. It was Michael's final message to her, preserved exactly as he'd left it. "Mrs. Patterson, I need a private room where I can review these documents." "Of course. Conference room B is available and it's completely secure." Alone in the small conference room, Elena stared at the envelope for several minutes before breaking the wax seal. Part of her wanted to preserve this last tangible connection to Michael, but she knew that understanding his final message was more important than sentimentality. Inside were three items that would change everything: a handwritten letter on Michael's personal stationery, a USB drive labeled Atlantic Coast Insurance, evidence, and a small brass key attached to a tag reading, Storage Unit 47B, Southside Self-Storage. Elena unfolded the letter with trembling hands, seeing Michael's familiar handwriting. For the first time since his death, my dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and Marcus Morrison has decided that silencing me permanently is preferable to allowing me to expose his crimes. I pray that I'm being overly paranoid, that you'll never need to open this envelope. But if you are reading these words, then you need to know the truth about what I discovered and why my life may be in danger. 6 months ago, while reviewing insurance claims for the Waterfront Commons project, I noticed irregularities that initially seemed like clerical errors. Premium payments that didn't match the actual policies issued, claims that were paid out to shell companies that didn't seem to exist. And most troubling, a pattern of overbilling that affected nearly every major construction project in Boston over the past 5 years. Atlantic Coast Insurance, under Marcus Morrison's leadership, has been systematically defrauding clients and pocketing millions of dollars in excess premiums. But that's not the worst of it, Elena. They've also been deliberately creating unsafe conditions on construction sites, then collecting insurance payouts when accidents occur. 3 workers have died on projects insured by Atlantic Coast in the past 18 months, deaths that could have been prevented if proper safety protocols had been followed. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't be party to a system that treats human lives as acceptable losses in service of corporate profits. So I began collecting evidence, financial records, emails, recorded conversations with Morrison's associates. Everything I gathered is stored on the USB drive in this envelope, and additional physical documents are in the storage unit whose key is enclosed. Elena, if something has happened to me, you have 2 choices. You can take this evidence to the FBI and help bring Morrison to justice, knowing that doing so might put you and Sophie in danger from men who have already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Or you can destroy everything, forget what you've learned, and try to build a safe life for yourself and our daughter. I won't presume to tell you which choice to make. You've always been braver than you realized, stronger than you believed, and more capable than our society has encouraged women to be. Whatever you decide, I will understand and support from wherever I am now. But Elena, please know this: Morrison is a dangerous man surrounded by dangerous people. If you choose to pursue justice, you must be extraordinarily careful. He has resources, connections, and a willingness to destroy anyone who threatens his empire. Don't trust the police completely. Morrison has corrupted officials before. Find someone independent, someone with experience in corporate fraud cases, someone who can't be bought or intimidated. I love you and Sophie more than my life, which I am apparently about to prove. Take care of our beautiful daughter. Tell her that her father fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous. And Elena, please don't let grief and fear prevent you from living fully. You deserve happiness, love, and peace. All my love always. Michael. Elena read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Michael hadn't just discovered insurance fraud. He'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy responsible for multiple deaths. He'd known that Marcus Morrison might kill him, had prepared this evidence as both a weapon for justice and a warning for his family. She plugged the USB drive into her laptop with hands that shook with emotion rather than fear. The drive contained hundreds of documents, email exchanges between Morrison and his associates, financial records showing the systematic overbilling of clients, and, most damning of all, recorded phone conversations in which Morrison explicitly discussed the need to eliminate problems that threatened their operation. In one recording, Morrison's voice came through with chilling clarity. Michael Sterling is asking too many questions about the Waterfront Commons claims. We need to consider whether he represents an ongoing threat to our interests. Another voice, one Elena didn't recognize, responded, "How do you want to handle it?" "Permanently, Marchem," Morrison replied. "Make it look like an accident, something that won't generate extensive investigation." Elena's hands flew to her mouth as the full horror of what she was hearing sank in. This wasn't just evidence of insurance fraud. It was a recording of her husband's death sentence being pronounced by the man who would carry it out. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom Chen. "Everything okay? You've been in there for over an hour." Elena quickly typed back, "Found what we were looking for. Much worse than we thought. Need to meet immediately. She gathered up all the materials, sealed them in a new envelope, and made her way back upstairs to the main banking floor. Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a concerned expression that suggested Elena's emotional state was more transparent than she'd hoped. "Mrs. Sterling, are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine. Just some difficult family business. Thank you for your help." Outside the bank, Elena climbed into Tom Chen's sedan with the envelope clutched against her chest like armor. Chen took one look at her face and immediately started the engine. "That bad. Worse. Tom, we're not just dealing with insurance fraud. Morrison is responsible for multiple murders, including at least 3 construction workers whose deaths he orchestrated for insurance payouts." Chen's expression grew grim as Elena explained what she'd found. He listened without interruption while she played portions of the most incriminating recordings, his face growing darker with each revelation. "Elena, this changes everything. Morrison isn't just trying to cover up financial crimes. He's trying to eliminate witnesses to multiple homicides. The level of danger you and Sophie are facing is much higher than we initially estimated. What do you recommend? We need to get you and Sophie into protective custody immediately while we turn this evidence over to federal authorities. Morrison has too many resources and too much to lose to let you survive with this information." Elena thought about Sophie's courage in photographing their stalker, about Kate's years of protecting their family while hiding the truth about Michael's death, about the letter in which her husband had told her she was braver than she realized. "No," she said firmly. "We stick to the original plan. We set the trap and we catch Morrison ourselves." "Elena, that was before we knew he was a serial killer. The risk is too high now." "The risk has always been high, Tom. Morrison has been planning to eliminate me and Sophie since Michael's death. We just didn't understand his timeline. But now we have leverage. We have evidence that can destroy him completely. That makes us more powerful than we were this morning." Chen studied her face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading criminal psychology. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Marcus Morrison has spent 2 years believing he holds all the cards that he can strike at his convenience and eliminate the last threats to his empire. But what if he's wrong? What if the prey he's been stalking is actually a predator in disguise?" Elena's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Kate's name appeared on the screen, but when Elena answered, it was Sophie's voice she heard, small and frightened but trying to sound brave. "Mommy, I need you to come home right now. Something bad is happening." Elena's heart stopped. "Sophie, what's wrong? Where's Grandma Kate?" "She's here, but she's hurt. Mommy, there are men in our house." The line went dead. Elena stared at the silent phone, feeling the world tilt around her in ways that made the morning's revelations pale in comparison. Morrison hadn't waited for them to set a trap. He'd decided to spring one of his own. "Tom, we need to get to the house, now." Chen was already accelerating through Boston traffic, his professional calm overlaying what Elena suspected was the same cold fury she felt building in her own chest. "Elena, I'm calling for backup. We can't handle this alone." "How long until police can respond?" 10 minutes if we're lucky. Longer if Morrison has people monitoring police communications. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours if Sophie was in immediate danger. Elena thought about her daughter's courage, about the way she'd photographed their stalker, despite being terrified about the promise she'd made the night before to keep Sophie safe. "Tom, I need you to understand something. If Morrison or his people hurt my daughter, I will kill them myself. I don't care about evidence or trials or justice. I will kill them." Chen glanced at her with something that might have been respect. "Elena, your daughter is one of the smartest kids I've ever met. If she managed to get a phone call through, it means she found a way to hide or escape. She's buying us time." "Time for what?" "Time for us to save her, and time for Morrison to make the mistake that finally brings him down." As they raced through the streets of Beacon Hill, Elena clutched Michael's envelope and thought about the choice he'd presented her in his letter. She could try to keep Sophie safe by surrendering to Morrison's demands, giving him whatever he wanted in exchange for their lives. Or she could fight back, using Michael's evidence, to destroy the man who had already taken so much from their family. The choice Elena realized had never really been a choice at all. Marcus Morrison had made the fatal error of threatening her daughter. And now Elena Sterling was going to teach him the difference between a victim and a survivor. Bam! The Sterling house sat silent and seemingly peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. its Victorian facade revealing nothing of the violence that had unfolded within. Tom Chen parked 2 blocks away, and they approached on foot, using the cover of neighboring buildings and parked cars to avoid detection. "I count 2 vehicles that don't belong in this neighborhood," Chen whispered, pointing out a black SUV and a gray sedan parked with clear sight lines to the Sterling house. "Professional surveillance positions." Morrison brought a team. Elena's mind raced through the layout of their house, trying to identify where Sophie might hide, how many entry points Morrison's people might be watching, what advantages they might exploit. But all her architectural training just seemed inadequate preparation for a situation where her daughter's life hung in the balance. "Tom, I need to get inside that house." "Not without backup. Elena, these are professional criminals. They've probably killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened." Elena thought about Sophie's phone call, about the controlled fear in her daughter's voice, despite the terror she must have been feeling. Sophie is inside with killers, and every minute we wait increases the chance that Morrison decides she's more liability than asset. Before Chen could stop her, Elena was moving toward the house, staying low behind parked cars and using her intimate knowledge of the neighborhood to approach from an angle that would minimize her exposure to the surveillance vehicles. She reached the small alley that ran behind their block of houses, leading to the back garden where she and Sophie had planted vegetables the previous spring. The rear door to their kitchen had been Michael's addition to the original Victorian design, and Elena knew its lock had been loose since the previous winter. The door opened silently under her touch, confirming her hope that Morrison's people had focused their attention on the front of the house. Elena slipped inside, her heart hammering as she tried to move silently across the hardwood floors that had betrayed so many of Sophie's attempts at midnight snacking. The house felt different, not just empty, but violated. Furniture had been moved, drawers, opened, books pulled from shelves. Morrison's people had been conducting a thorough search while holding Kate and Sophie captive. Elena heard voices from the living room, deep male voices discussing something in urgent whispers. She crept closer, using the architectural details she'd memorized during years of living in the house to avoid the floorboards she knew would creak. Should have found it by now. Sterling wouldn't have made it difficult for his family to access. Maybe the old lady isn't telling us everything she knows. Should we apply more pressure? Morrison said no permanent damage until we're sure they don't have what we need. But the kid might be more cooperative if she thinks her grandmother is in danger. Elena's vision went red at the casual way they discussed threatening Sophie. She forced herself to remain calm, to think strategically rather than emotionally. 3 male voices, which meant Morrison had brought significant backup. But they were looking for something they hadn't found yet, which suggested Kate and Sophie were still alive because Morrison still needed them. Elena's phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Sterling, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Come to your living room alone, and we can discuss this like civilized people." The casual tone of the message, the assumption that Elena would comply with his demands, filled her with cold rage. Marcus Morrison had killed her husband, terrorized her family, and invaded her home. And now he expected her to negotiate as if he were a reasonable person rather than a predator. Elena typed back, "Let my mother and daughter go, and we can talk." The response came immediately. "I'm afraid that's not how this works. You have 1 minute to join us, or I'll be forced to demonstrate why cooperation is in everyone's best interest." Elena looked around the kitchen, where she'd shared so many meals with Michael and Sophie, where Kate had helped her rebuild her life after tragedy, where 3 generations of Sterling women had created the kind of family bond that Marcus Morrison would never understand. She opened the knife drawer and selected the largest blade, then made her way toward the living room where the voices were coming from. The scene that greeted her would be burned into her memory forever. Kate sat tied to one of their antique chairs, a bruise darkening the left side of her face, but her eyes still sharp with defiant intelligence. Sophie was curled in the corner of the room, apparently unharmed, but clutching her small digital camera like a lifeline. And standing in the center of Elena's living room wearing an expensive suit and examining her grandmother's antique vase with the casual interest of a tourist was Marcus Morrison. He looked exactly like the photographs Tom Chen had shown her, but somehow more substantial in person. A man accustomed to commanding rooms and bending others to his will. When he turned to face Elena, his smile was warm and charming, as if this were a social call rather than a home invasion. Mrs. Sterling, thank you for joining us. I apologize for the dramatic circumstances, but I'm afraid your family has been less than forthcoming about the location of certain materials that belong to me. Nothing in this house belongs to you, Elena replied, noting the positions of Morrison's two associates, large men who looked more like bodyguards than investigators. I think you'll find that's not entirely accurate. Your late husband took certain documents from my offices before his unfortunate accident, documents that contain proprietary business information as well as some personal materials that I'm quite eager to recover. The casual way Morrison referred to Michael's murder as an unfortunate accident made Elena's grip tighten on the knife hidden behind her back. I don't know what you're talking about. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Mrs. Sterling, I've been watching your family for 2 years. I know that your husband left you something important enough to store in a bank safe deposit box. I know you visited that bank this morning, and I know you are currently in possession of materials that legally belong to me. Even if that were true, breaking into my house and threatening my family is hardly a legal method of recovering your property. Legal methods have their limitations, Morrison replied, especially when dealing with stolen goods and uncooperative witnesses. Sophie spoke for the first time since Elena had entered the room, her voice small but steady. Mommy, he says Daddy stole from him. But that's not true, is it? Elena looked at her daughter, 9 years old, traumatized by her father's death, now facing the man who had killed him, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Sophie deserved to know the truth, deserved to understand that her father had died as a hero rather than a criminal. No, sweetheart, Daddy didn't steal anything. He discovered that this man was stealing from other people, and when he tried to stop it, this man killed him. Morrison's charming facade finally cracked. Michael Sterling cost me millions of dollars and years of careful planning. He interfered in business that didn't concern him, threatened to destroy everything I'd built. I gave him multiple opportunities to reconsider his position, but he chose to be a problem rather than a solution. He chose to be honest rather than complicit in murder. Murder is such a dramatic word. I prefer to think of it as problem solving. Your husband was a problem. The 3 construction workers who died on my insured job sites were problems. And now, unfortunately, your family has become a problem as well. The casual admission of multiple murders delivered with the tone of someone discussing stock portfolio optimization confirmed Elena's worst fears about the kind of man they were dealing with. What do you want? She asked. I want the USB drive and any other evidence Michael collected. I want the key to whatever storage facility he was using. And I want your assurance that you'll forget everything you've learned about my business operations. And if I refuse, Morrison glanced meaningfully at Sophie, then at Kate, then your family will experience the same kind of unfortunate accidents that have befallen other people who've proven uncooperative. Elena thought about Michael's letter, about his faith in her strength and courage, about the choice he'd given her between safety and justice. She thought about the recorded conversations on the USB drive, Morrison's own voice ordering Michael's death, the evidence that could finally bring him to justice. Mr. Morrison, she said, I think you've made a critical error in your planning. What kind of error? Elena smiled, feeling a cold satisfaction as she saw uncertainty flicker across Morrison's features. You assumed that I'm the same broken woman who lost her husband 2 years ago. But I'm not that person anymore. She pulled out her phone and showed Morrison the recording app, which had been running since she'd entered the room. Every word you've spoken in the last 10 minutes has been recorded. Your admission of murdering my husband, your threats against my family, your confession to multiple homicides. All of it captured in your own voice. Morrison's composure finally shattered completely. Give me that phone. I don't think so. You see, while you were busy terrorizing my family, I was learning how to fight back. And Mr. Morrison, you've just confessed to enough crimes to put you in federal prison for the rest of your life. Morrison gestured to his associates, who began moving toward Elena with professional efficiency. But before they could reach her, Tom Chen's voice cut through the tension from the doorway. Federal agents, everyone on the ground now. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouted commands, drawn weapons, and the controlled chaos of a law enforcement takedown. Morrison's men were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by agents who'd had time to prepare and coordinate their response. Elena rushed to Sophie, pulling her daughter close while keeping one eye on the handcuffed figure of Marcus Morrison being read his rights by Tom Chen. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" "I knew you'd come," Sophie whispered. "I knew you wouldn't let him hurt us." Kate, freed from her restraints but still shaky from the ordeal, joined their embrace with tears in her eyes. "Elena, I'm so proud of you. Michael would be so proud of you." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to Elena with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over. I have resources, connections. I'll find a way to make you pay for this." Elena met his gaze steadily, feeling the strength that came from having faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. "Mr. Morrison, you've already taken everything from me that you're ever going to take. But I'm going to take everything from you. Your freedom, your reputation, your empire. And I'm going to do it using the evidence my husband died to protect." She held up the USB drive, letting Morrison see the weapon that would finally destroy him. "This is Michael's gift to our family. Justice delivered exactly when we needed it most." The federal courthouse in Boston had never felt as imposing to Elena as it did on the morning of Marcus Morrison's trial 6 months after his arrest in her living room. She stood on the granite steps, clutching Sophie's hand while reporters shouted questions and camera flashes exploded around them like lightning. "Mrs. Sterling, how do you feel about testifying against your husband's killer?" "Sophie, what was it like being held hostage by Marcus Morrison?" "Dr. Sterling, do you think justice will finally be served today?" Elena had learned to ignore the media circus that had surrounded their family since Morrison's arrest, but she couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility she felt as the key witness in a case that would determine whether Michael's murderer spent the rest of his life in prison. Tom Chen appeared at her elbow, his steady presence a comfort in the chaos. "Ready for this?" "As ready as anyone can be to relive the worst day of their life in front of a jury," Elena replied. Over the past 6 months, the investigation into Morrison's crimes had expanded far beyond Michael's murder. Federal agents had uncovered a network of corruption that reached into city government, the construction industry, and law enforcement itself. Morrison had spent 15 years building an empire based on fraud, intimidation, and violence, and his collapse had sent shockwaves through Boston's business community. The evidence Elena had retrieved from Michael's safe deposit box had been the keystone that brought down the entire structure. The USB drive contained not just proof of Morrison's insurance fraud, but detailed documentation of his other criminal enterprises. Money laundering, bribery, witness, intimidation, and a systematic pattern of murder, disguised as workplace accidents. But the most damaging evidence had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Morrison's arrest, Elena had received a phone call that changed everything. The voice belonged to James Morrison, Marcus's son, who had apparently been living in Chicago under an assumed name for the past 5 years. "Mrs. Sterling, my name is James Morrison. I believe you knew my father." Elena's blood had run cold at the familiar surname. "What do you want?" "I want to help you destroy him." The conversation that followed had revealed a family dynamic so toxic that Elena almost felt sorry for Marcus Morrison's son. James Morrison was a 35-year-old man who had spent most of his adult life trying to escape his father's influence, only to be repeatedly dragged back into Morrison's criminal enterprises through threats and manipulation. "My father has been planning his revenge against your family for 2 years, James had explained during their first face-to-face meeting at Tom Chen's office. "He blamed your husband for the collapse of his insurance empire, even though Michael Sterling was just trying to do the right thing." "Why are you telling me this?" James had pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Because I've been documenting his crimes for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to bring him down. Your husband's evidence combined with mine will be enough to put my father away forever." The documents James provided had been devastating financial records, showing Morrison's systematic theft of insurance premiums, photographs of meetings with organized crime figures, and most damning of all, audio recordings of Morrison ordering the deaths of people who threatened his operations. "He made me listen to the recording of your husband's murder," James had said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wanted me to understand what happened to people who crossed our family. But all it did was convince me that I had to stop him before he destroyed more families." Now, as Elena climbed the courthouse steps with Sophie and Kate flanking her, she thought about the strange alliance that had formed between the Sterling family and Marcus Morrison's own son. James had risked everything to provide the evidence that would finally bring his father to justice, and in doing so, he had given Elena something she hadn't expected: forgiveness. Not for Marcus Morrison. That man would never deserve forgiveness for what he'd done to Michael and their family, but forgiveness for James, who had been trapped in his father's web of violence and corruption and had finally found the courage to break free. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of Morrison's other victims. Elena took her seat in the witness section, noting the irony that she was sitting just 20 feet from the man who had killed her husband. Marcus Morrison looked different than he had during the home invasion. 6 months in federal custody had aged him, and the expensive suits had been replaced with standard prison attire. But his eyes still held the same cold calculation that had made Elena's skin crawl during their first encounter. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Walsh. No relation to Detective Sarah Walsh, who had helped catch Morrison. She was a sharp, efficient woman who had built her career prosecuting organized crime, and she laid out the government's case with devastating precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next week, you will hear evidence of a criminal enterprise that operated in our city for 15 years. You will learn about a man who built his fortune on the deaths of innocent people, who murdered anyone who threatened to expose his crimes, and who terrorized families in pursuit of profits that he believed were more important than human lives. Elena listened as Walsh described the scope of Morrison's crimes: the systematic defrauding of insurance clients, the deliberate creation of unsafe working conditions that resulted in multiple deaths, the corruption of public officials, and the murder of Michael Sterling when he threatened to expose the entire operation. The defendant didn't just kill Michael Sterling, Walsh continued. He destroyed a family. He left a young woman widowed, a little girl fatherless, and a grandmother watching her family struggle to survive trauma that should never have been inflicted. When Morrison's defense attorney rose to deliver his opening statement, Elena was struck by the hopelessness of his position. How do you defend a man whose crimes have been documented in his own voice, witnessed by his own son, and corroborated by financial records spanning 15 years? The defense strategy appeared to be character assassination, painting Michael as a disgruntled architect who had fabricated evidence out of professional jealousy, portraying Elena as a grieving widow who had allowed her desire for revenge to distort her memory of events, and suggesting that James Morrison was an unstable son seeking to destroy his father out of psychological dysfunction. It was a desperate strategy, and Elena could see from the jury's expressions that it wasn't working. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days, with witness after witness detailing Morrison's crimes. Construction workers testified about unsafe conditions on Morrison's insured job sites. FBI agents explained the elaborate financial schemes used to hide stolen insurance premiums. Insurance adjusters described how Morrison had pressured them to approve fraudulent claims. But the most devastating testimony came from James Morrison himself. Elena watched as Marcus Morrison's son took the witness stand, noting the physical resemblance between father and son that made this family betrayal even more dramatic. James was tall and lean like his father, with the same aristocratic features and natural presence. But where Marcus projected cold calculation, James radiated genuine remorse. "Mr. Morrison," the prosecutor began, "how long have you known about your father's criminal activities?" "Since I was 18 years old," James replied, his voice steady despite the emotion Elena could see in his eyes. "That's when he first asked me to help him intimidate a witness who was threatening to testify against one of his business associates." "And did you help him?" James was quiet for a moment, and Elena saw him glance briefly at his father before answering. "Yes. I was young, scared of disappointing him, and I didn't understand the full scope of what he was asking me to do. But I helped him threaten that witness, and she decided not to testify." "What was your relationship with your father like?" "Complicated. He was charming and generous when I did what he wanted, terrifying and cruel when I didn't. For most of my adult life, I believed that his approval was worth any price I had to pay. It took me years to understand that the price he was demanding was my soul." Elena found herself moved by James's testimony, even though this was the son of the man who had destroyed her family. She could see the genuine pain in his face as he described a childhood spent watching his father manipulate and destroy people, an adolescence spent being gradually inducted into criminal enterprises, and an adulthood spent trying to escape the web of corruption that had defined his family. "Mr. Morrison, did your father ever discuss Michael Sterling with you? Yes, for months before Mr. Sterling's death, my father was obsessed with him. He saw Sterling as a threat to everything he'd built, someone who was too honest and too stubborn to be bought or intimidated. Did he ever discuss plans to eliminate that threat? James looked directly at his father, and Elena saw 20 years of fear and resentment in that gaze. He told me that Michael Sterling would have to be removed from the equation before he could cause more damage. When I asked what that meant, he said that sometimes problems had to be solved permanently. Did you interpret that as a threat against Mr. Sterling's life? I knew my father well enough to understand that when he talked about solving problems permanently, he meant murder. The courtroom was absolutely silent as James continued his testimony detailing how Morrison had ordered Michael's death, how the plane crash had been arranged to look like mechanical failure, and how Morrison had celebrated the successful elimination of a threat to his empire. Elena felt tears running down her cheeks as she listened to the clinical details of her husband's murder, but she also felt something she hadn't expected, a strange sense of closure. For 2 years, she had wondered about Michael's final moments, had tormented herself with questions about whether he had known what was happening, whether he had suffered. Now she knew that Michael's death had been quick, that he had died, believing he was simply traveling to a business meeting, that he had been spared the knowledge that his commitment to honesty had signed his death warrant. When Morrison's defense attorney rose to cross-examine James, Elena expected him to attack the witness's credibility, to suggest that his testimony was motivated by personal animosity rather than commitment to truth. Instead, the defense attorney made a tactical error that would haunt the rest of the trial. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment against your father since childhood? Yes, James replied calmly. And isn't it true that you've fantasized about destroying his reputation and his business? Yes. So your testimony today is really just the fulfillment of a lifelong desire for revenge, isn't it? James was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtful attention Elena had noticed throughout his testimony. When he finally answered, his voice carried a quiet strength that filled the entire courtroom. Sir, I spent 35 years loving a man who turned out to be a monster. I spent 35 years making excuses for his behavior, justifying his crimes and enabling his destruction of innocent people. If wanting to stop him from hurting more families makes me vindictive, then I accept that label, but I would rather be vindictive than complicit. The defense attorney's attack had backfired spectacularly, transforming James from a potentially unreliable witness into a heroic figure who had sacrificed family loyalty in service of justice. When Elena was finally called to testify, she felt ready for the ordeal in a way she couldn't have imagined 6 months earlier. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, making eye contact with the jurors, projecting the strength and determination that had carried her through the darkest period of her life. The prosecutor's questions were straightforward. What was Michael like? How had his death affected their family? What had Elena found in the safe deposit box? How had Morrison threatened her and Sophie during the home invasion? Elena answered each question clearly and completely, but she found herself speaking not just to the jury, but to Michael's memory. This was her chance to tell the world who her husband had really been. Not just a victim of Marcus Morrison's greed, but a man who had chosen to risk his life rather than ignore injustice. Mrs. Sterling, the prosecutor asked, why do you think your husband decided to investigate Morrison's insurance fraud rather than simply reporting his suspicions to authorities? Elena thought about the question, remembering Michael's passion for his work, his belief that architecture was about creating spaces where people could live safely and happily. Michael believed that buildings weren't just structures, they were homes, workplaces, communities. When he discovered that Morrison was deliberately creating unsafe conditions on construction sites, he couldn't stand by and let more people die. He knew that reporting suspicions might not be enough, that Morrison had connections and resources that could make evidence disappear. So he decided to gather irrefutable proof that would ensure justice was done. And what did that decision cost him? Everything, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. It cost him his life, and it cost Sophie her father, and it cost me the love of my life. But it also gave us Retry JN, Continue Edit, something invaluable. The knowledge that Michael died as a hero fighting for people he'd never met, people whose safety mattered more to him than his own. The cross-examination was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. Morrison's defense attorney tried to paint Elena as an unreliable witness consumed by grief and vengeance, but her calm responses and detailed recollections undermined every attack. When the attorney suggested that Elena might have fabricated evidence out of a desire for revenge, she responded with quiet dignity. "Sir, I spent 2 years believing my husband died in a random accident. 2 years accepting that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason. If I were motivated by vengeance rather than truth, don't you think I would have created a more satisfying narrative than one that revealed how completely I'd been living a lie?" The prosecutor's redirect was brief but powerful. "Mrs. Sterling, what do you hope to accomplish by testifying here today?" Elena looked directly at Marcus Morrison for the first time during her testimony meeting. His cold gaze was steady determination. "I want to make sure that no other family suffers what mine has suffered. I want Michael's death to mean something more than just another victory for greed and corruption. And I want my daughter to grow up knowing that sometimes when good people fight back, justice actually wins." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: murder, in the first-degree conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, racketeering, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Marcus Morrison never walk free again. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions as the verdicts were read. Relief that justice had finally been served, satisfaction that Morrison would pay for his crimes, but also a profound sadness that no verdict could bring Michael back or restore the years of happiness that Morrison had stolen from their family. As Morrison was led away in shackles, he turned to look at Elena one final time. But instead of the hatred she expected to see, his expression held something that looked like grudging respect. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," he said quietly. "I'm exactly as strong as Michael always knew I was," Elena replied. "You just never bothered to look beneath the surface." 6 months after the trial, Elena stood in the garden behind their Beacon Hill house, watching Sophie plant tulip bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring. The physical scars of Morrison's invasion had been repaired. New lock security system, fresh paint in the living room where Kate had been held captive. But the emotional healing was an ongoing process that would probably continue for years. Sophie had surprised everyone with her resilience. The child therapist they'd been seeing had explained that children who survive trauma often emerge stronger and more self-aware than their peers, and Sophie seemed determined to prove that theory correct. She'd started a school project documenting stories of people who had fought injustice, and she'd interviewed everyone from civil rights activists to FBI agents who investigated white-collar crime. "Mom," Sophie said, looking up from her gardening, "do you think Daddy would be proud of what we did?" Elena knelt beside her daughter, brushing soil from Sophie's hands with the same gentle attention she'd given to scraped knees and hurt feelings over the years. "I think Daddy would be amazed by how brave you were, sweetheart. Taking that photograph of Morrison's man staying calm when you were scared, helping us gather evidence. You did things that most adults couldn't have done. What about you? Do you think he'd be proud of you too?" The question caught Elena off guard. For 2 years after Michael's death, she'd struggled with feelings of inadequacy, convinced that she was failing to live up to the standards he'd set as a parent and partner. But the events of the past year had taught her something important about her own capabilities. "I think he'd be surprised by some of the things I turned out to be capable of," Elena said. "But maybe he knew all along and he was just waiting for me to figure it out myself." Kate appeared on the back porch carrying a tea service that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. At 65, if she'd officially retired from psychology, but had been informally counseling other families affected by Morrison's crimes, she'd found purpose in helping people navigate the complex emotions that came with surviving trauma and seeking justice. "James Morrison is here," Kate announced. "He says he has something for Sophie." Elena felt her usual complicated emotions at the mention of James's name. Over the past year, he'd become an unlikely fixture in their lives, testifying at the trial, helping federal agents unravel his father's criminal network, and somehow evolving from Morrison family associate to Sterling family friend. The relationship was awkward for obvious reasons, but Elena had come to respect James's courage in choosing justice over family loyalty. Sophie adored him, perhaps because he represented proof that people could change, that being born into darkness didn't mean you had to live there forever. James emerged from the house carrying a wrapped package and wearing the slightly uncertain expression he always had around Elena. Despite their alliance in bringing down his father, he remained acutely aware that his surname carried associations with the worst period of Elena's life. "Hello, Sophie," he said, settling onto the garden bench that Michael had built the spring before his death. "I brought you something I thought you might like." Sophie wiped her hands on her jeans and accepted the package with the careful attention she brought to everything these days. Inside was a professional quality digital camera, the kind that serious photographers use for important assignments. "It's beautiful," Sophie breathed, examining the camera with expert appreciation. "But it's too expensive. Mom says we can't accept expensive gifts from people." James glanced at Elena, who nodded permission for him to explain. "Sophie, this camera belonged to your father. He used it to document his architectural projects, to take pictures of buildings and construction sites. After he died, it was stored with his other professional equipment." Elena felt her breath catch. "How did you get Michael's camera?" James's expression grew uncomfortable. "My father took it from the crash site before investigators arrived. He was looking for evidence that Michael might have documented his discoveries about the insurance fraud. The camera was in storage with other items my father collected over the years." The knowledge that Morrison had stolen Michael's belongings as trophies of his victory filled Elena with fresh anger, but she pushed those feelings aside to focus on what mattered now. "Sophie," she said, "your daddy would want you to have that camera. He always said that the most important thing an architect could do was see the world clearly and help other people see it too." Sophie cradled the camera like the precious gift it was. "I'm going to use it to take pictures of important things, things that help people understand the truth." "That's exactly what your father would have wanted," James said quietly. As the afternoon faded into evening, Elena found herself sitting alone with James while Sophie and Kate prepared dinner inside. The silence between them was comfortable now in a way that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked. "Testifying against your father, destroying your family?" James considered the question with the thoughtful attention she'd come to associate with him. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to do the right thing. I regret all the people who were hurt while I was still choosing family loyalty over justice. But I don't regret stopping him." "What will you do now?" "I'm working with the FBI to help them understand how criminal enterprises like my father's operate. Apparently, growing up in that environment gave me insights that are useful for prevention and prosecution." Elena nodded, struck by the symmetry of James using his traumatic childhood experiences to help other families avoid similar trauma. "Elena," James said hesitantly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to feel completely free to say no." "What is it?" "Sophie's birthday is next month, and she mentioned that she's never been to New York City. I was wondering if you'd let me take both of you there for the weekend. I know someone who works at the Museum of Natural History, and I thought Sophie might enjoy a behind-the-scenes tour of their photography exhibitions." The invitation was generous and thoughtful, exactly the kind of experience that would delight Sophie. But Elena also recognized it as something more, an attempt by James to create positive memories with their family, to build relationships based on shared interests rather than shared trauma. "James, that's incredibly kind of you to offer." "But," Elena smiled at his ability to read her hesitation, "but I think it's important that any relationship between our families be built on choice rather than obligation. Sophie likes you because you're kind to her and you share her interests, not because you feel guilty about your father's crimes." "I understand." "Do you? Because I want to be very clear about something. You don't owe us anything, James. You've already done more than enough to make amends for your family's crimes. If you want to be part of our lives, it has to be because you genuinely want friendship, not because you're trying to balance some cosmic scale of justice." James was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophie through the kitchen window as she helped Kate set the table. "I've spent most of my adult life trying to escape my father's influence," he said finally. "But being around your family has taught me something important about what family can be when it's built on love instead of fear. If you'll let me, I'd like to learn more about that." Elena studied his face, seeing genuine warmth beneath the careful politeness. "Ask Sophie about New York. If she wants to go, and if you promise to let her take approximately 3,000 pictures with her new camera, then yes." The smile that transformed James's features was like watching someone step out of shadow into sunlight. For the first time since she'd met him, Elena could see the man he might have become if he'd grown up in a family like hers instead of a family like his father's. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, clutching her father's camera and making plans for the hundreds of photographs she would take in New York, Elena sat alone in Michael's study. She'd avoided this room for most of the 2 years since his death, but tonight she felt ready to be surrounded by his presence. The room looked exactly as he'd left it, architectural drawings scattered across his drafting table, coffee-stained mugs, holding collections of pencils and rulers books about design and construction history filling every available shelf. On the wall hung photographs of his completed projects, schools and hospitals and office buildings that would shelter people long after everyone involved in their creation had been forgotten. Elena pulled out the letter Michael had left in the safe deposit box and read it again, struck anew by his faith in her strength and his love for their family. He'd known that pursuing justice might cost him his life, but he'd chosen to fight anyway because he believed that some things were more important than personal safety. At the time, Elena had seen his choice as a betrayal. How could he risk leaving her and Sophie alone in the world? But now she understood that Michael's decision had been an act of love, not just for his family, but for all the families who might suffer if Morrison's crimes continued unchecked. She thought about the gift of truth that Michael had left for them, wrapped in evidence and sealed with his final act of courage. The truth about his death had been devastating to unwrap, but it had also set them free. Free from the guilt and confusion that had defined their grief, free from the fear of unknown threats, free to understand that their loss had meaning beyond random tragedy. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Tom Chen. Federal agents arrested 3 more Morrison associates today. The network is completely dismantled now. Your family can sleep safely. Elena typed back, "Thank you for everything, Tom. We couldn't have done this without you. You did the hard part. I just provided technical support." Elena smiled at his characteristic modesty. Tom Chen had become more than a private investigator to their family. He'd become a friend and protector whose steady presence had helped them navigate the most dangerous period of their lives. She walked to the window and looked out at the quiet streets of Beacon Hill, thinking about all the families sleeping peacefully in their homes, unaware that their safety had been purchased with Michael's life and their family's willingness to fight for justice. Tomorrow, Sophie would wake up excited about their upcoming trip to New York, eager to explore the world through the lens of her father's camera. Kate would continue her work, helping other families heal from trauma. James Morrison would continue his efforts to undo the damage his father had caused. And Elena would continue the process of rebuilding her life, not as the broken woman who had lost everything, but as the strong woman who had fought back and won. The gift of truth had been unwrapped, and its contents had transformed their lives in ways that went far beyond justice or vengeance. It had taught them that love was stronger than fear, that courage could grow from the darkest soil, and that sometimes the most precious gifts came wrapped in the most painful packages. Michael Sterling had died fighting for truth, and his family had honored that sacrifice by refusing to let his death be in vain. They had turned their grief into strength, their fear into courage, and their loss into a legacy that would protect other families for generations to come. As Elena turned off the lights in Michael's study and headed upstairs to bed, she felt his presence surrounding her like a warm embrace. He was gone, but his love remained woven into the fabric of their daily lives and the foundation of their family's future. The gift of truth had been received, unwrapped, and cherished, and Elena Sterling was finally ready to move forward, carrying Michael's love with her into whatever adventures lay ahead. 1 year later, the Sterling Family Foundation held its first annual fundraising gala on a crisp October evening, exactly 3 years after Marcus Morrison had first begun stalking Elena's family. The ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel was filled with federal agents, prosecutors, victim advocates, and families who had been affected by white-collar crime. Elena stood at the podium looking out at an audience that represented the transformation of their personal tragedy into something that could help others. Sophie sat at the head table wearing a dress she'd chosen herself and carrying the camera that had become her constant companion. Kate was nearby, elegant and proud, still serving as the family's anchor, while expanding her role as a counselor for crime victims. And at a table near the back, James Morrison sat with several FBI agents, continuing his work to help law enforcement understand and combat the kind of criminal enterprises his father had built. 3 years ago, Elena began, my family learned that evil often hides behind respectable facades, that the people who hurt us most are sometimes the ones we least expect to be dangerous. But we also learned something more important, that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to fight back. She looked at Sophie, who was documenting the evening with the serious attention she brought to all her photography projects. The Michael Sterling Foundation exists to help families recognize the warning signs of fraud and manipulation, to provide resources for people who find themselves targeted by predators, and to ensure that the truth tellers and whistleblowers of the world know they're not alone in their fight for justice. The applause was warm and sustained, but Elena barely heard it. She was thinking about Michael, about the letter he'd left her, about his faith, that she would find the strength to not just survive, but to transform their loss into something meaningful. After the formal program ended, Elena found herself approached by a young woman whose story was heartbreakingly familiar. "Mrs. Sterling, my name is Sarah Chen. My husband was one of the construction workers who died on Marcus Morrison's job sites. I wanted to thank you for having the courage to bring him to justice." Elena took Sarah's hands, feeling the weight of connection between women who had lost the men they loved to the same monster. "I'm so sorry for your loss. How are you managing? Some days are harder than others. But knowing that Morrison will never hurt another family, it helps. And the Foundation's Victim Assistance Program has been incredible. For the first time since my husband died, I feel like I have a future." As the evening wound down, Elena stepped onto the hotel's Harborview terrace, needing a moment of quiet to process the complex emotions the evening had stirred up. Sophie joined her, carrying her camera and wearing the satisfied expression that she got when she'd captured exactly the images she'd been hoping for. "Did you get some good shots tonight, sweetheart?" "I got pictures of people helping each other," Sophie replied with the matter-of-fact tone she used to describe her most important work. "Pictures of people who turned bad things into good things. Pictures of people being brave." Elena pulled her daughter close, marveling at the wisdom that trauma had given this remarkable child. "What do you think Daddy would say about tonight?" Sophie considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "I think he'd say that the best way to honor people who die fighting for what's right is to keep fighting until everyone is safe." That sounds exactly like something he would say. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of Boston Harbor twinkle like fallen stars. In the distance, Elena could see the neighborhood where they lived, where Marcus Morrison had once stalked them, where their family had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger than before. "Mom," Sophie said quietly, "do you think we'll ever stop missing him?" Elena thought about the question, about the empty place in their lives that would always belong to Michael, about the ongoing process of learning to carry love and loss in the same heart. "I don't think we'll ever stop missing him, sweetheart. But I think we'll keep finding new ways to feel close to him. Through the foundation, through the families we help, through the way we choose to live our lives with courage and kindness. Like the camera. Exactly like the camera. Every picture you take with Daddy's camera is a way of seeing the world through his eyes, of using his tools to help people understand truth and beauty." Sophie nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "I'm going to take pictures of brave people for the rest of my life. That way Daddy's camera will always be doing important work." As they headed back inside to rejoin the celebration, Elena felt a deep sense of completion. The gift of truth that Michael had left them had been fully unwrapped. Now its contents transformed into something that would protect and heal other families for generations to come. Marcus Morrison would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, but his legacy of fear and violence had been replaced by something more powerful, a family's determination to ensure that truth and justice prevailed, no matter the cost. The Sterling family had survived their darkest hour and emerged as champions for others facing similar darkness. They had learned that the most precious gifts often came disguised as disasters, that strength could be found in the depths of despair, and that love was indeed stronger than fear. Michael Sterling's legacy lived on not just in the buildings he had designed, but in the lives his family continued to protect and heal through their commitment to truth, justice, and the unshakable belief that good people could overcome evil when they chose to fight back together. The gift of truth had been received, unwrapped, and shared with the world. And in sharing it, the Sterling family had discovered the most precious truth of all, that love once given could never truly be taken away.